On July 22nd, 2026, President Trump made a promise on camera that I do not think the White House fully thought through. He said that every single time Iran strikes a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States will hit an Iranian bridge or an Iranian power plant in return. One ship equals one bridge or one power plant. That is the formula now. Not a case-by-case decision. Not a National Security Council meeting weighing options. A fixed automatic exchange rate between a tanker and a piece of Iranian infrastructure. On the very same day at Dover Air Force Base, Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at attention as the transfer cases of 4 fallen American service members were carried off a military aircraft. And in the Iranian province of Hormozgan, the province that actually contains the port city of Bandar Abbas and physically borders the strait itself, inflation has now hit 101.4%. 3 facts, a mechanical retaliation formula, 4 flag-draped caskets, a province economically collapsing in real time. Every major outlet is reporting these as 3 separate stories happening on the same news day. I want to argue today that they are actually one story. And once you see how they connect, you will understand why Trump may have just handed Iran something far more valuable than any missile could ever be worth. He handed them predictability. Let me explain exactly what I mean by that, because this is the core argument of everything I want to show you today. I call this the automatic retaliation trap. In military strategy, there is a very old and very well understood principle. The moment you announce a fixed automatic response to a specific trigger, you have not actually strengthened your deterrence. You have transferred control of the escalation clock to your adversary. Think about what Trump's bridge for ship formula actually does in practice. It tells Tehran with complete precision exactly what happens the moment they choose to hit a tanker. No guessing, no ambiguity, no risk that Washington might respond with something far larger or far smaller than expected. Iran now knows the price of every single ship they choose to hit. And once you know the exact price of an action in advance, you are no longer being deterred by that price. You are simply doing cost accounting. You can now choose precisely how much pressure you want to apply on any given day by choosing how many ships to hit, and you know in advance exactly what you will get back in return. Now let me walk you through the evidence piece by piece, because I want to show you this is not just clever wordplay on my part. This is a pattern you can actually trace through the last several weeks of this war. First, look at the timing of the announcement itself. This bridge for ship formula did not appear out of nowhere. It came after 9 confirmed ship attacks since July 6th, according to maritime risk firms tracking the strait. The CEO of one maritime risk service described the security situation as having returned to what he called a worst-case scenario for tankers. Crews are reportedly more frightened now than at any earlier point in the war. So the formula was announced specifically because the previous approach of case-by-case retaliatory strikes was clearly not stopping the attacks. Trump needed to project decisiveness, but in trying to look decisive, he actually removed the one thing that made American responses genuinely unpredictable and therefore genuinely threatening. Second, look at what happened to global shipping traffic the moment uncertainty entered the picture versus what is likely to happen now that a fixed formula exists. Before this war, roughly 20 million barrels of crude per day moved through Hormuz. In the opening days of the conflict, shipping volume collapsed by as much as 86% in a single day specifically, because nobody knew what would happen next. Uncertainty is what actually stops commercial shipping. Insurance underwriters cannot price risk they cannot model, but a fixed and openly announced formula is precisely the kind of thing insurance markets can model. Once shippers understand exactly how the United States will respond to any given Iranian action, the risk becomes calculable rather than chaotic. And calculable risk gets priced into insurance premiums, rather than avoid it entirely. Trump may have just made it easier for global shipping to eventually return to the strait, not because the danger went away, but because the danger became predictable enough to underwrite. Third, and this is where the story becomes genuinely strange, look at what Iran itself has been building administratively throughout this entire war. Iran established what is now being called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority. This is not a military unit. This is a bureaucratic administrative body designed specifically to manage and control transit through Hormuz on Iran's own terms. Tehran has consistently framed its position not as closing the strait entirely, but as asserting the right to control who passes and how. Iran wants to be the toll authority for the most important waterway on Earth. And a fixed, predictable American retaliation formula actually helps that project rather than hurting it. If Tehran knows precisely what a strike on any given tanker costs them in terms of American retaliation, they can build that cost directly into their own administrative fee structure for the ships they do allow through. You are watching two competing governments, each try to build a stable, predictable system around the same 18-mile wide strip of water, one using naval blockades and airstrikes, the other using bureaucratic authority and selective attacks calibrated against a now publicly known price list. Fourth, look at the human cost that is being absorbed to maintain this system on the American side. 4 American service members whose transfer cases arrived at Dover on the same day as this announcement. These were not the first American deaths in this conflict, and multiple reports indicate they will not be the last. Air defense soldiers protecting bases in Jordan and elsewhere across the region have absorbed a significant share of these casualties over recent weeks as Iranian strikes have continued despite the naval blockade and the nightly American strike campaign. According to Kepler, which tracks maritime traffic, 56 confirmed incidents involving commercial shipping have now occurred in and around the strait, with 17 seafarer fatalities documented among merchant crews alone. Every one of those incidents forces Washington into a decision point under the new formula. Every bridge or power plant struck in response is itself a target that could kill Iranian civilians working at those facilities or living near them. The mechanical nature of the new doctrine does not make the human cost on either side any less real. It simply makes the sequence of decisions that leads to that human cost more predictable in advance for everyone, except the people who actually die in the exchange. Fifth, and this is the number I think deserves far more attention than it has gotten, that 101.4% inflation rate, specifically in Hormozgan province, is not an abstract statistic. This is the province where the physical infrastructure of the Strait crisis actually lives. Bandar Abbas is Iran's most important southern port. The people living in this province are simultaneously hosting the naval and military assets Iran is using to contest the strait, while also absorbing the worst economic consequences of the broader war, including American blockade pressure and the collapse of normal trade. Compare that number to the inflation rates in neighboring provinces, Khuzestan at just under 99% and Bushehr at 96.5%, both of which also border Gulf waters. You have an entire coastal region of Iran experiencing economic conditions that are genuinely catastrophic by any historical standard, while their government continues to project strength and control over international shipping lanes from the same stretch of coastline. That contradiction between visible strategic assertiveness at sea and invisible economic collapse on land is not sustainable indefinitely, no matter how disciplined the Mosaic Defense Command structure remains. So when you put these 5 pieces together, you get a picture that looks very different from the simple story of an American president finally getting tough with Iran. What you actually have is a fixed and openly telegraphed retaliation formula that hands Tehran exact predictability over the cost of every action it takes. A shipping market that may paradoxically stabilize precisely because the danger became easier to price rather than because it became smaller. An Iranian administrative authority that benefits from predictable American responses just as much as Washington believes it benefits from appearing decisive. American service members continuing to die in a conflict now governed by a fixed exchange rate rather than genuine strategic flexibility, and an Iranian coastal province experiencing economic collapse so severe that it calls into question how long the current strategy of asserting straight control while absorbing this level of domestic economic damage can actually continue. Sixth, I want to add historical context here because I think it sharpens the point considerably. During the late 1980s, toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, both sides engaged in what became known as the tanker war, where each nation attacked the other's oil infrastructure and merchant shipping in the Gulf. That earlier conflict eventually drew the United States Navy directly into escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the strait under Operation Earnest Will. The lesson historians have drawn from that period is that once a great power commits itself to a specific and repeatable protective or retaliatory role in the strait, it becomes extremely difficult to disengage from that role without appearing to abandon the commitment publicly. Trump's bridge for ship formula is not simply a tactical announcement. It is the kind of open-ended standing commitment that historically tends to lock great powers into decades-long postures in this exact stretch of water. The tanker war did not fully end until the Iran-Iraq war itself ended in 1988. If the current formula holds in a similar way, Washington may be signing up for a multi-year rhythm of infrastructure strikes rather than a temporary response to a temporary crisis. Seventh, I want to look specifically at what a fixed price does to Iran's own internal command structure. Remember the Mosaic Defense Doctrine that gives 31 separate provincial IRGC commands pre-delegated authority to act without waiting for approval from Tehran. A fixed and openly announced American retaliation formula actually simplifies decision-making for those decentralized commands in a way that a case-by-case American response never could. Under the old uncertain system, a provincial commander launching an attack on a tanker had no way of knowing whether Washington would respond with a symbolic gesture or with devastating, overwhelming force. That uncertainty by itself functioned as a natural brake on independent local decision-making, even within a decentralized command structure. Once the price is fixed and known in advance, any one of those 31 provincial commands can make a fully informed local decision about whether a given tanker strike is worth the guaranteed cost without needing any additional guidance from the central government at all. In other words, Trump's attempt to look tough by fixing the formula may have inadvertently made Iran's already decentralized command structure even easier to operate independently across all 31 provinces simultaneously. Eighth, and I want to bring in the insurance industry specifically, because this is where the abstract strategic argument becomes very concrete very quickly. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting Hormuz spiked dramatically in the opening weeks of this conflict precisely because underwriters could not model the range of possible American and Iranian responses to any given incident. Insurance markets fundamentally hate unbounded uncertainty far more than they hate high but bounded risk. A known and published retaliation formula on the American side, combined with Iran's own published transit regulations under the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, actually gives underwriters two separate data points they can use to build an actuarial model rather than a single chaotic variable they cannot price at all. If premiums begin stabilizing or even declining slightly in the weeks following this announcement, despite continued ship attacks, that would be very strong confirmation that markets have started treating this entire conflict as a manageable and priceable transaction cost rather than as genuinely unbounded danger. Now let me steelman the opposing view, because I always try to do this honestly before I ask you to accept my own framework. You could argue that a fixed and publicly announced retaliation formula is not a weakness at all, but actually the single most effective form of deterrence available given the circumstances. The argument goes like this: ambiguous case-by-case responses had already failed to stop 9 separate ship attacks since July 6th. Iran was not being deterred by uncertainty because Tehran had correctly calculated that Washington was unwilling to escalate dramatically regardless of what happened. By making the response formula explicit and severe, striking actual infrastructure like bridges and power plants rather than simply military targets, Trump is raising the visible cost of each individual attack in a way that cannot be walked back or downplayed. This is public commitment as a strategy. Once you have announced a policy, this specifically in front of cameras, backing away from it, becomes politically impossible, which is exactly the kind of credible commitment that classical deterrence theory says should work. Under this reading, predictability is not a gift to Iran. Predictability is the entire point because it removes any doubt in Tehran about how seriously the threat should be taken. That is a genuinely coherent argument, and there is real theory behind it. But here is what that argument cannot explain. If the formula is working as pure deterrence, you would expect ship attacks to decline sharply following the announcement, rather than continuing at the pace they have maintained throughout July. And more importantly, classical deterrence theory about credible commitment generally applies to preventing an action from happening in the first place. It works far less well once an adversary has already demonstrated repeatedly that it is willing to absorb retaliation as a known cost of doing business. Iran has already shown through 9 attacks in just over 2 weeks that it is prepared to accept whatever comes next. Once an adversary has crossed that psychological threshold from being deterred by uncertainty to simply pricing in a known cost, the entire logic of the deterrent flips. It stops preventing the behavior and starts becoming a routine and predictable transaction cost that gets factored into a broader strategic calculation about how much economic and military pressure Iran wants to apply on any given week. Now let me bring in the actor who I think benefits most from this specific dynamic. And once again, I keep coming back to the same answer, which is China. Every single shipping company currently trying to model risk through Hormuz has to build assumptions about how predictable American retaliation actually is. A fixed formula makes that modeling easier for everyone, including Chinese state shipping interests that continue moving enormous volumes of discounted Iranian crude through waters adjacent to the strait, even during the most intense weeks of this war. China does not need Hormuz to be safe. China simply needs Hormuz to be predictable enough that its own tankers carrying sanctioned Iranian oil can continue calculating acceptable levels of risk. A mechanically announced American retaliation doctrine that trades one bridge for one ship is in a strange way exactly the kind of stable input Chinese logistics planners can work with far more easily than genuine chaos. Beijing has said nothing publicly about Trump's new formula, but I would be very surprised if Chinese shipping insurers and state trading companies were not already running the exact same cost-benefit models that Tehran itself is now able to run against a publicly known American price list. Let me give you 3 specific things to watch over the coming days, because this is how we test whether the automatic retaliation trap framework actually holds. First, watch whether the pace of Iranian ship attacks in the strait increases or decreases in the 2 weeks following this announcement. If attacks continue at the same rate or increase, that is strong evidence the formula has become a known cost rather than an effective deterrent. Second, watch specifically what categories of infrastructure the United States actually strikes each time this formula gets invoked. If the targets chosen consistently avoid facilities that would cause mass civilian casualties, that will tell you Washington is trying to maintain the appearance of a strict formula while quietly preserving genuine discretion behind the scenes. Third, watch the inflation numbers coming out of Hormozgan, Khuzestan, and Bushehr provinces specifically over the next month. If those numbers continue climbing at anything close to their current pace, that regional economic collapse, rather than any battlefield development, may end up being the actual factor that eventually forces a change in Iranian strategy around the strait, regardless of how many ships get hit or how many bridges get struck in response. Fourth, watch war risk insurance premiums, specifically for vessels transiting Hormuz over the next several weeks. If those premiums begin to stabilize or decline even slightly despite continued attacks, that is the single clearest possible confirmation that global shipping markets have started treating this entire conflict as a bounded and priceable cost of doing business rather than as the kind of open-ended chaos that shuts down a shipping lane entirely. A stabilizing insurance market alongside a continuing war would be the most concrete possible proof that the automatic retaliation trap framework is correct, and that predictability rather than deterrence has become the actual outcome of Trump's new formula. For your homework this week, I want you to go read the full CNN live coverage from July 22nd and pay close attention to the exact wording Trump used when describing the bridge or power plant formula. Notice whether he described it as a warning aimed at deterring future attacks or as a description of what has already begun happening. That distinction in tense tells you whether this is meant to prevent future strikes or whether it is simply a public description of an ongoing policy that was already underway before the cameras arrived. Then go read the Nor News report on Hormozgan inflation and compare the numbers to what Iranian state media was reporting about the same province back in March when this war first began. The trajectory of that specific number over 5 months will tell you more about the real state of Iran's southern coast than any military briefing from either side. So let me leave you with the actual question I think matters most after everything we have gone through today. Everyone keeps asking whether Trump's new formula will finally stop Iran from attacking ships in the strait. I think that is the wrong question entirely given everything the evidence actually shows us. The right question is this: when a great power announces a fixed and mechanical rule for how it will respond to provocation, rather than preserving genuine strategic ambiguity, has it actually strengthened its position, or has it quietly handed its adversary the one thing every adversary in history has always wanted most, which is the ability to know in advance exactly what a given action will cost? Because if Iran can now calculate with precision exactly how many bridges and power plants each tanker strike is worth, then the war has not become more controlled. It has simply become a transaction with a published price list. And transactions with published price lists tend to continue for exactly as long as either side believes they can still afford to pay. History rarely rewards the side that makes its threats too specific, because specificity is a gift you hand your enemy even while believing you are handing them a punishment. The generals who study this war years from now may conclude that the moment the retaliation formula became public was the moment Washington stopped controlling the tempo of this conflict, and Tehran quietly started controlling it instead. Think about that. I will see you in the next one.